formal meeting. This is a listening meeting. This, our intention, members of the planning board, we have a couple who are attending via a Zoom. But let's introduce ourselves. I'm Bill Terry, I'm planning board chair.
I'm Sarah Kimball.
Kathy Huffington.
I'm Mr. Campbell.
And on Zoom, listening in, because we're here to listen, are Dick Bennett and Jim Laska. Thank you for coming out this evening. It's not exactly a solar day. And we weren't sure about folks coming out this evening, but we figured the snow and rain would stop enough that we could get started on this. Our purpose this evening is really to give you the opportunity to hear about what we're trying to accomplish relative to solar regulations in the town of Jackson. I think to a large degree this was prompted probably by the things that were occurring in Lovell, Maine, and realizing that without any regulation, there's no real opportunity to determine how people might do an installation for solar collection. I think most of us, and probably most of you, would prefer to have the opportunity for solar collection. I think we're going that way. It's a green idea. If we're going to get away from fossil fuels, we need to do it. And as the economies of scale work, it's more likely that more folks will have installations in their homes at their place of residence than they have currently. So we have diligently been looking at 42 different model regulations that when you get the package, they're like 17 pages long because they accommodate most every kind of municipality there might be. We are a little bit different as a municipality. We are Los Angeles, or we don't have areas where we can have 10,000 acres worth of a solar farm. Some places do have that. It's interesting to see how the regulations might scale up for something like that. Our intention in looking at this was to ensure that we have regulations that fit within our master plan, which it right now doesn't accommodate a lot of the concepts of solar, but it does accommodate the idea that we do want our community to still look like a community that we're used to. And that probably suggests that we don't want a 15 or 20 acre solar farm in town. Or if we do have solar in town, somebody installs that it's properly set on a lot. If someone puts it on the roof, we want to make sure that we are not getting too much involved in that process. But if somebody's going to want to put it in their front yard, 5 feet from somebody else's house, we might be worried about that. So we tried to take a look at things and tried to balance the idea of having installations that are useful for everybody, for their homes, for the community, but disallowing really any commercial ventures. That was not what we came up with. What we're here tonight to listen to is, you might have different views, you have different perspectives, you may think we're crazy. And if we are, we'd like to listen to what kind of crazy we are. And see whether or not there's something we should do differently. I know that we have made some changes. By the way, let me give credit where credit is due. This lady, Sarah Kimball, is fantastic at looking at something that's 17 pages long and reducing it to something that you can print on 2 sides of a piece of paper. Fantastic, thank you. And it actually, you can read it. It makes sense, it's in English, it's understandable English, I think. At least I can read it, and it makes sense to me. And that's very different from the model stuff that we got in the first time. You have to have a PhD in solar science to absorb all the different kinds of ways they talk about it, the grids and the graphs and all the other things. So Sarah's done a great job of doing this. She's captured, just last week, we talked about some changes. She's captured those changes again. I have some disagreements with what she did, even. So I'm going to have some comments even for us tonight. And we welcome your comments. This is more for us to hear your concerns. I'm not sure the best way to do this. We can go through and talk through the various points. Bottom line basics are that we're trying to do two things. One is that if you have a rooftop installation, we want to stay out of that. Do a rooftop installation, there are building codes that regulate how you do that, what you do, and we already have a process for that. So we'd like to stay clear of that. And I think the real concern is around ground installations. And ground installation is anything that's not on your roof. Ground installations can obviously be as large as the space you have available. And that's the problem. We don't really want to have people putting in 600 panels on a half-acre lot. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us in terms of keeping the town looking like the town that we want it to be. So what we devised is said, okay, we want to, for any installation, for it to be an accessory use. And you'll see the word accessory and you can say, what the heck is that? Well, an accessory means it's not put in, installed, to do more than provide for your need, as opposed to putting enough installation in such that you're using it as a commercial venture or profit. It's intended to meet your requirements for you, for your home, for your domicile. The other piece that's there, and again, we want to hear. We've said basically no commercial installations in town. No. We are and have in here the allowance for a community installation. In other words, the town of Jackson decides they want to put up a solar field. And it's limited, it's limited to a 5-acre installation. That's a long short of it. I'm going to sit down and shut up and start opening these up and shut this thing. And I would appreciate any comments. Anyone want to start? Please. This is your evening. This is for you to read through. If you haven't looked at it, and if you have looked at it, if you have something to say, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Martha Benish. I live up on 16. I know some of you got it. But I'm thinking about, years ago, your steep slope ordinances. I don't know where they are. I just remember them years ago, everybody discussing steep slopes around here. And Route 16 corridor was one of the places that had a lot of them on the right-hand side of going up the road. And I guess my question is, I don't know if it's clear here or maybe it isn't, I don't understand, but could I, let's say, tear down on a steep slope and put up solar? That sounds terrifying to me. In terms of, what's the balance? How do you work with that?
Yeah. Right now, we do have building codes already. Right, and building codes have some limits on what you can and cannot do in terms of setbacks. Those are already set. We didn't put new regulations in for things that are already covered in
right. Yeah, I just don't know where you're at with that, that's all.
And But to be honest, I don't know the exact answer to your question. Say you live and you own a property, and you have some steep area on your property, and you wanted to do the installation on that, in that location.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily thinking our property as much as driving up the road on the right-hand side, you just see these very sharp cliffs going
Yeah.
up. They're all south-facing, they're gorgeous.
Yeah.
It'd be the perfect place for solar energy. And I don't know if people have houses, I don't know what lots are there, I know there are some lots, there's some national forest. But the potential is there that somebody could build on a very steep slope. Is that good, is that bad? I don't know.
I can't answer your question. I'm not sure if anyone here can answer your question around the steepness of the slope on which it's set. What I can say is that the way we have the regulations set is that it needs to be something that is properly screened. So if someone's building it on the side of a hill, it's gonna be hard to, that's open to that's gonna be hard to screen. And so, and for the ground installations, for sure, what we're intending is, if you look at this, is to have a process where abutters are notified and the comments, a 30-day comment period allows for anyone to come in and say, hey, this is terrible. The application itself needs to identify where it's going to be located and what kinds of efforts are being made in order to do it properly with proper screening that is in the regulation. So I want to try to answer your question, which I'm not sure I can, is that if it were on a slope and someone could properly screen it, yeah.
That's fine, it's, you know, I'm just always, I guess, thinking of the guys going to
You see
figure
the
out how to do
notice,
it.
it says reasonably screened. You see the
You know,
notice?
I'm always thinking of the guy who comes in and complains it's hardship, oh, I can't screen it, but I need it, and therefore we're gonna have it glaring at us.
Yeah. And that's kind of where we don't want to get to. At least that's been the planning board's vision. Again, we, you know, if you said, look, all you guys said, you guys are crazy. We really would like to put in as much of this stuff as we can. We'd like to be totally fossil fuel independent. And we'd like to make sure everybody can put in an acre level field in everybody's home. And everybody felt that way. I guess our regulation would follow that. And we might have to consider something different than what we proposed. Yes, sir.
Hi, Peter Benson. I have several comments. One is a firefighter, two, a couple as an individual. I'll start off the, I think, the easier one under roof-mounted solar systems, where it says 2 emergency access, where it says 2A, roof-mounted solar systems, et cetera, solar energy systems. I think that should be part of the defining language, because without that, you don't get to the height or anything else. We have several installations in town that don't meet code and that are dangerous because they don't meet the setbacks on the roof. Everybody goes to roof, but if they're not done with the proper setbacks, there's really no point. So I would encourage you to make that part of maybe the defining language. And then just to tighten up, it seems like you're defining for large commercial, like commercial solar and residential, but there's also small commercial. You should make some mention of small commercial, like if an Airbnb or an Airbnb inn or a small business wanted to do solar, it's not defined in here, so I would think that you might want to define it.
Answer to both of your questions. Peter, on the first page, the second 17.2, sorry about that. The number 4 is shall comply with all building, electric, fire, and other safety codes. state and federal laws, regulations, noise. So, we do have it there
Okay.
as for general regulations. In other words, there's a lot of codes already in place, we don't need to state them again, we just need to say, you've got to follow them.
So I would just say, okay, that's great, Sarah, just to make some mention of commercial, small commercial, like,
Yeah.
if anyone wanted to do it.
So you have 2 points.
Yeah.
The section
I have-
that-
yeah.
I don't know whether this is the right terminology, just pulling it off of one of the models, but under definitions, number 7, it says community scale solar energy system. I mean, we were talking about, well, you know, maybe you might want to have a small installation more than just what would be accessory to a home or a business. And so banning about various sizes, 5 acres could seem to be a reasonable limit, so that it wouldn't be as big as an industrial scale, such as what was proposed in Lovell and this.
So you think that commercial would fall, theoretically
Right.
fall under? Okay, great.
And using the word community, there is the idea of a community getting there, like a condo association that would have one solar field that would benefit everybody. But the idea is that it's at a community scale, so that it would be, you know, larger than just one residence, but not so large as an industrial installation.
Can I just do my last one and I'll shut up?
Sure.
What do you want to do?
Just to follow up on that point, so community scale solar systems, that's a 5 acre, that's like a standard with those community scale sizes? I'm just curious, yeah.
There are, we looked at a lot of
Yeah.
towns around with their ordinances, as well as some of the models that have been put up. There's one from Massachusetts, another one from Wisconsin, and one from New Hampshire. And as he said, 17-page, would go into detail as to how a community could get together and do it. So if using a different term would indicate that it's small commercial, maybe community or small commercial instead of on the community scale. But anyway, an installation that 5 acres seems to be, would be a size that would not be onerous to the viewpoint, but still.
Yeah, you're kind of trying
Trying to balance.
to, yeah, exactly, okay. So Pete had, I think,
But somebody else can go, I can wait.
Go ahead.
It's Mike Jackson. So the definition of small commercial should be more clearly defined as in a small business where they're commercial use versus small commercial that I could put on my property 5 acres and sell my power. That's that type of commercial.
yeah.
So the definition of commercial in this instance should be a little bit more clearly defined.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we kind of bandied about whether or not we would put language in or not put language in relative to the use of the word accessory. And the whole idea of an accessory use is that it has to be something that can only be used on your property. So if you're suggesting, for example, someone puts in an installation that's large enough that they're selling more than what they're using, that's not accessory. And then the question, and I'll give Dick Bennett some credit. He's sleeping. Oh no, he's good. He's listening in. We talked the other day, and one of the thoughts he had was, and he had read it, that maybe one of the ways we can help with the concept of accessory is to identify what we mean by that a little bit better, and perhaps to suggest that Dick, I hope I'm representing correctly, that it would be 150, no more than 150% of the current load on a particular house or business. So that there would be some limit that you could actually do a calculation and identify what that is, as opposed to some nebulous kind of idea, because I look at accessory and think, well, what the heck's that? One man's accessory could be somebody's primary in their own heads. You know, it's like, okay, this is what it's supposed to be. And so maybe there is some way we can identify within the language that there's some measure that we can use, somewhat arbitrary. My pushback to Dick was, well, okay, the household load right now doesn't include my 2 Teslas that I'm going to have, or Fords or Chevys, whatever they are 5 years from now, that are all electric, and it doesn't include the heat pump that I'm going to change over from my oil burner at some point. Both of those are possibilities, maybe not for the next 5 years for me, but maybe the next 10 years. And so 150% of the current load may be well under what I might use 5 or 10 years out. So on the other hand, maybe I just need to put more panels on at some later point in time. And so having something out there rather than nothing, I think is probably not a bad idea.
Yeah, I would just, I would support what Dick has as a definition, like 150%. And part of the reasons is because we do net metering at our house. You do not get $1 back for every dollar that it costs you to buy power right now. So that there is a discrepancy between those. And it's fair in the utility market that it's as such. But it can't be just based on how many watts or kilowatts that you're generating. It should also take into consideration the dollar amount. And I think, you know, relative to 150%, I think something like that is reasonable, because if you're going to expand, it's no different than if you have a house and you decide you're going to put a couple extra bedrooms in, then you have to address the septic system at that time as well, as to whether it meets it or not. So there is, I think, room, but somewhere in the 150%, I think, is a very valuable way to take a look at this.
Okay.
I would also suggest that you have a definition of community scale, but you want to build a definition that's of residential/commercial based on your 150%, because you don't have a definition right now as to what a residential or a in-town commercial unit is actually in this definition here. I do have a couple other points here, and I mean, I was a bad boy and didn't start reading this till this afternoon, so we can argue this out at the house afterwards. But when you get down to the 17.2, which is Sarah noted, actually should be 17.3 in the general regulations. The application for the building permit shall contain, and yes, it should have a proposed solar energy system, so on and so forth. But the plan for screening and a list of abutters, I take a look at this and I say, if I want to put a shed out front or something like that, I don't have to go through this at all with my abutters, and I don't have to go through it, you know, as far as going through a planning, a screening or something. So this is very biased against a solar system. And I can put a shed in front of my house, and it may be ugly to my neighbors. And we don't have any ordinances that prevent that. And yet here, where we have a system to help address a major problem in front of society, we're putting an extra roadblock in front of them from doing it. So I actually find this rather unreasonable, in that we're making somebody go through that, but we don't relative if they want to park an old RV out front, or if they want to put a big old shed out front, or whatever the case may be. So I think you want to take a second look as to whether you really want that roadblock in front of, you know, somebody that wants to apply this. A couple of other things, when you get into decommissioning, you have the solar panels will be recycled. That means that the town actually has to follow up and have somebody follow the fate of that solar panel, do we actually, as a town, have the ability to enforce that? Because if you don't, why do we have the regulation? I think it's the right thing to do, but there may not be a market for it, and we as a town don't actually have the ability to enforce that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the word recycle is the right word.
It is correct for the decommissioning part,
Yeah,
but I think you got language here that's probably not enforceable.
it probably isn't,
Yeah.
but we have a lot of regulations that aren't enforceable, like a 30-mile-per-hour speed limit on Garden Notch Road. We suggested, and we may occasionally actually check and find somebody for exceeding or doing not the right thing. I guess the question I have is whether or not you include something because it's the right thing to do versus you don't include it because you're not able to figure out at the moment. Because right now, I don't think anybody here knows how the recycling process might occur. I don't.
But your legal language here is shall, and legally that's a different term.
Yeah, but it's just that you shall do it, you know.
I'm just giving my.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Yeah.
The question is whether I understand the word recycle because my number one plastic is not being recycled right now. So I agree with you on that word. But in terms of decommissioning, ensuring that it's actually,
I fully support the decommissioning.
that there's demolition, you know. At the other point you made around the not being intrusive, we talked about this, and this was an ad between last week, Thursday's meeting and today. And I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this myself. And the reason I don't agree with it is because it's in the general regulation, and I don't really think it belongs for rooftop installations at all. I'm open to the idea of it being available for ground installation. So, and I think that was my intention, at least, in thinking through this, as to whether or not there should be some sort of notice or process around this. And we just threw this thing out. I mean, again, Sarah does a great job of listening to us and putting something into words that we can actually look at. And so I'm not sure what the process would look like, to be honest. I mean, we right now the building inspector does get an application. They do provide information about where the siting is on the lot. Abutters are not required. That's an additional requirement that would be suggested here. It doesn't currently require a 30-day notice period, but it does require the building inspector the opportunity to review and approve or disapprove.
Well, I should modify my comment because it's under general regulations right now. If you're at a community scale, then I think it's appropriate to go through the abutters and so forth. If it's at the residential scale, I question it for the reasons I stated before.
Yeah, what are your thoughts? I mean,
I tend to agree with Ken. Only when we built our house 10 years ago, we had a decision between solar and geothermal. Just to show that things have changed. Geothermal was cheaper back then than solar. Now it's completely flipped. But one of the main drivers was that basically the ground-mounted solar, because we are a small grandfathered lot, and the aspect of the house wouldn't lend itself to a roof-mounted array. Just we wouldn't get any gain. We were forced to look at the ground, and because ground-mounted units are ground-mounted solar is basically viewed as a structure. That we wouldn't be able to do because we wouldn't be able to meet any of the setback requirements. But I don't think that's really quite fair because we don't require that fuel tanks, as Ken said, sheds. We have a generator that's on our property line. We have 2 propane tanks.
We talked to the abutter about
Yeah, but there's no legal, I think you're setting the bar a lot higher for ground mounted solar than you are for just about anything else. Even saying it has to be in the back or the side yard. I don't think solar's any more or any less ugly than a propane submarine or a couple of fuel tanks. It's energy. It's the same thing as a power pole. If you're going to use the energy, you've got to live with it. That's just my 2 cents. And then I would also just say for just being able to define your terms of saying where it says under 17.5, the solar system shall have a reasonable visual buffer. Reasonable to one may not be reasonable to another. So just I would encourage you to just make a definition there. And who decides that reasonableness?
Yeah, for anyone who questions why we were thinking of that, take a ride up Switchback. And then I would appreciate you giving me a call.
it. So Switchback, there's an example? Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be good, yeah. I mean, just sort of driving around and just.
And not to pick on the people on Switchback, because they said they are actually going to do an installation to screen come next year when they can put plantings in. But look at it as it is now. And right now, the regulation would allow what that installation looks like. And I would say to you that I don't want that in Jackson. Yes.
Hi, my name is Brian Post, and I have quite a few comments, so if anyone wants to go quickly, go for it.
I'm like you, I had a bunch of it.
Come on, we're listening.
Okay.
This is what our ears are for, right?
I'll get into what I wrote down, but I just wanted to really quick touch. I'll have to drive up Switchback in the next few days and check it out, but maybe I'll agree with you, but I wouldn't be surprised if my impression of like, oh, that's really cool, that looks like a couple of cool panels or 4 panels. So I think that just talks to the point of what you think is ugly, I might think is kind of cool and aesthetic from an alternative energy standpoint. But
I've already heard from about 40 people that it's not cool.
Ooh, I definitely want to go up there.
I don't hear from 40 people about any of it.
Sounds
I've
good.
already heard from 40 people it's not cool.
Yeah.
Don't try to switch.
A couple of people have already touched on some points that I talked about, so I'll try to go through quick. But anyways, thank you to the planning board for all your work and allowing us to have input. I know it's tough work. We have solar panels on the south face of our roof. We produce more electricity than we use on our all-electric house, so we're huge fans of solar. I understand that solar installations are more visible compared to other building aspects, but I'm kind of concerned about some of the over-regulation. We have multiple neighbors on our street with roof-mounted solar, and I've obviously never had an issue with it, or never had an issue with other roof or ground-mount systems in town. We'll see. On the other hand, on lots of occasions I've had issues with air quality with wood stoves. I've been walking around our neighborhood, walking my dogs, and been practically choking and running to get out of. So that's kind of where I thought about this whole issue, and one of the big reasons I wanted to come down is I didn't want solar to be over-regulated when people can put in horrible wood stoves and burn whatever they want. So I think that's something to consider. So I would encourage the town of Jackson to adopt solar-friendly ordinances so that other residents can easily and affordably install solar energy systems. This is a benefit to the public's health, safety, and welfare. And I do have some specific comments and questions. This doesn't have to be answered now, but I'm wondering why community-scale solar was limited to 5 acres. Would it make sense to be more than that at some point? I'm just thinking again as an example, like if a developer had a lot of 10 acres of land they wanted to develop, I suppose this is an aesthetic thing, but would we want to see, tons of condos built on that 10 acres, or maybe would we want to see 10 acres of alternative energy with, pollinator-friendly ground cover? It's just something I thought about.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and I appreciate your comment.
Battery high.
We don't have an awful lot of land in town that's not residential. And if we have a commercial installation on a residential lot, that's a commercial installation, it's a business. It's not permitted currently.
Right.
And I don't think we intend to add any more opportunities to dilute the residential nature of residential properties.
Sure.
And that would be my comment back to you, is that, and that is in our master plan.
Okay.
It's intentional that we do that. Our commercial properties are fairly limited, as some of you know and some of you don't know. It's where Martha lives, along the 16 corridor, and in the center of town is really the only commercial space we have. We do not have an awful lot of open land in town. 76% of our land is in conservation.
Yep.
There's currently less than 5% of the land available for any kind of building, other than additional residential lots.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know the right answer to
So
that.
it's like, trying, again, looking at regulations, the whole idea of what can you do versus what are the limits that we have within our own boundaries.
Right. In section 17.2, section 2B, I think that got into
Which 17
general regulations.
Okay, thank you.
17.2, and then section 2B within that about screening for ground mount systems. Again, I would, my thought would be that should go by any existing codes, to make sure that the language just isn't, vague about, how should a ground mount system be screened. I think that should go by codes and specific regulations rather than how abutters and other property owners feel about it, just because that's so subjective.
Yeah, it's a good point around the whole thing.
And I tried to look up whether there are screening requirements in the
We
national.
don't have any currently, of which I'm aware.
Ron, were you talking like in general, like screening just out there?
Well, it says under general regulations, the application for a building permit shall contain the plan for screening a proposed ground-mounted
Right.
solar energy system from abutting properties and adjacent rights of way. So is that required by code, or is that just a vague aesthetic?
It's a vague aesthetic. I don't believe we have anything in our code. There's nothing in the building code. And there's nothing in our current zoning ordinance that requires any kind of screening. You can be as ugly as you want. And unfortunately, ugly as you want. Somebody mentioned around putting a shed or propane bullet, as described it as, and those are pretty bad if they're not screened. And a shed can be something that you probably don't want to have, but we don't have regulation around. And again, this is just working through. If we don't say anything about it, that means you basically can put one of these structures up, right along the road.
But you can't because of setbacks. The
Well,
setbacks.
but you can put it right along the road if you're old, because you clear everything along the road up to your build. It meets the setback requirement, and the setback requirements have been changed in town, especially relative to right of way, so that we could allow for buildings to be closer to the road front. We did that to enable more live for your lifestyle. You best use your property. But that setback requirement is also less than it used to be, which means that you could clear whatever trees you have in the front of your lot, then put a solar installation right along the front, and basically what you would see driving up the road is solar installation after solar installation after solar installation. And that could be the potential of what we look like 10 years from now. Is that what we want?
Yeah, I mean, that's a judgment call, but it just seems like that should be spelled out clearly. Like, I mean, there either should be a code or a regulation defining screening, or there shouldn't be.
I hear you, but we need to do a better job.
Sure, oh, great. And then, I believe Ken already brought this up, but going back to the part of the application, including abutters, list of abutters, and a 30-day comment period. It's, you know, my understanding, no other permits in town require this. You know, it said you can build a house, build a shed, install a noisy generator, you can operate an STR without abutter input, and I think that is unfair to require that of solar energy systems. The one brief one in section 17.4, section 1, there's a height maximum of 15 feet for a ground-mounted system. I was just kind of curious about this. So there's a company in Vermont called All Earth Renewables, and I think they're one of the leading manufacturers of tracking systems. And those systems, granted, people aren't going to have their tracking system vertical often or at all, but they can go from 17 to 20 feet. So I think it might be worth looking into raising that 15 to 20 feet, just so that if someone wanted to put in 1 or 2 trackers on their property, they can't be shut down because the tracker can theoretically be topped out at 20 feet. Just some input on my end. Again, 17.4, section 3 about placement on a property. I don't think this should be limited to side or rear of a property, just because that regulation is not in place for anything else, like sheds, garages, propane tanks. And sometimes it can be hard to define what is a front yard, what's a side yard, what's a backyard. So I'd like to see that. I think that's over-regulating it by saying it has to be in a back or a side yard. And I think really the last thing I have is section 17.6, encouraging prior installations to comply with the regulations. I think that sounds great, but again, I'm just kind of curious if that ordinance exists for other ordinances in town. I mean, I guess it doesn't seem enforceable, and it sounds nice, kind of like the recycling part, but again, just thinking about unfairly regulating solar compared to other ordinances in town.
I was going to have the same comment, and I'll make a suggestion on how to deal with this.
That's the only thing I have. Thanks for allowing us to speak, and I'll give my comments and information on paper or PDF.
Good to be great.
Thanks.
Relative to his comment on 17.6, I was going to suggest that you just simply say that they're grandfathered if they exist, and if they're expanded, then they have to meet the new regulations, which is essentially the way if you're going to put extra bedrooms on your house, you have to meet the new regulations. So we should follow the same thing.
Somebody was.
There's a voice we haven't heard from yet.
I'm just sort of piggybacking on what some others have pointed out. I think that the issue of the screening needs to be either better defined or left out entirely because it's just too arbitrary. You want a screening that is 30 feet high. It just seems to be. And the issue of existing systems, 17.6 is unenforceable. I mean, there's no, you just make a suggestion, and in an ordinance that's sort of meaningless. And the idea that Peter's point to, there's no screening required for propane tanks. There's no setback requirement for propane tanks. And certainly a solar panel is a lot greener than a propane tank. And it brings to mind an old thing that Vinyl Haven had a generator in their lighthouse. summer person said to the lighthouse keeper, boy, that generator is damn annoying. And the lighthouse keeper said, it's damn annoying when you can't hear it. So your statement, I don't want to see Jackson looking like, you know, it's sort of, you know, there's one person's, you know, not nice to look at, there's another person's, I really like that. And
Well, the flip side of that would be, to me, that, you know, because, you know, maybe we didn't do it right on the propane cylinders. And so does that mean we should not do it right?
But I would suggest you remove 17.6.
Yeah, that was an ad between last week, Wednesday, and tonight. So we're seeing that for the first time as a group as well.
Yeah, I agree that the habit is that if you have a system already, if you're gonna change it, expand it, then that, because that type of regulation exists.
Expanding of non-conforming uses requires a permit.
Right.
Yeah, so the question is whether or not we need anything there at all, or are you just reiterating what is already a requirement in the building code?
In the past, we've looked at non-conforming uses like, for example, Christmas Farm Inn, that's a non-conforming use. And when they wanted to expand, they were permitted to do so, because the community thought it would be a good thing to do. And so the concept of regulating non-conforming uses is quite standard, but it's been very often waived.
Yes. Ken?
Yeah, I was just, and I think Brian's helped us out a little bit on this. Relative to the height, he touched on 17.4.1 and actually done some homework, which I haven't done yet. But when you get to 17.3 on a flat roof and 10 foot, I think again you want to double check this number because we had 3 to 4 feet of snow on the ground during the winter. So all of a sudden, you may end up with something that says you can only have 1.5 panels high on a flat roof, which is not what you want to actually try to regulate. So I think you want to take a look at your 10 foot and ask whether there's a better number that fits in there.
Martha, you have a comment?
I just, a comment on, approval of the abutters. I'm indifferent to that. I can see the pros and the cons. The only thing is I keep going back to my steep slopes and I drive by my road down at the golf course and I look up and I just keep thinking of the abutters can say it's fine, but I'm going to see this large block of, glass facing me. Do I like it? Don't I like it? I don't know, but it has nothing to do with a butter's approval because I'm a mile away watching it. So that sort of throws things off to me about who's approving what. And then it goes back to the worst case scenario, the horrible person you don't want to meet who decides on his steep slope to go and tear the whole thing down and put his solar panels on it. And, bleh. But I'm, how do I say it? It's just all those trees going. It's a balance here. Yeah, we want solar, but we're tearing down trees on a slope.
Just to help
How
your-
would you think of, how would you consider a way to allow something like that? I mean, the idea around this was to provide some opportunity, if there's a ground installation, for there to be a comment opportunity, and if there are any issues, that those would come up and be something that the building inspector is going to be doing the review and determination to the point you're asking who looks at this. But if the building inspector agrees, he's agreeing within set requirements.
Right.
And if he chooses not to approve, then it really ends up at the Board of Selectmen reviewing it. And it's the Board of Selectmen that would either overrule the process if it's subjective, if you will, or the property owner then has the opportunity to, I guess, go to the zoning board of appeals to question what the board of selectmen or the building inspector has.
Well, my question is, do you want to get that far? Is there some, I'm
Yeah,
I'm
but
not,
how do you-
I
but how do
don't
you-
feel warm and fuzzy.
How do you get that process in
Yeah,
there? Somebody,
yeah.
right now, somebody can just throw something up and say, oh, we're done.
The economics, actually, to your concern, probably rule out that possibility even happening. The reasons I mention that is you make most of your solar power, and I can tell you this from experience with our house, is in the summer. And in the summer, you want your panels to be almost flat. And in the winter, even though you want to crank them so that they're almost vertical to the ground to get the most, there's very little sunlight to actually harvest in the winter. So from a commercial scale coming in on steep terrain is a no-brainer. You probably wouldn't want to go there because there's no money in it.
That makes me feel good, thank you.
I can't guarantee you, but that's just how the business
Mr.
works.
Duggan.
Relative to decommissioning, how would you know, or who would know, if the system wasn't used for a particular period of time?
DM to find out.
Hmm? What was the answer?
I don't know.
If you don't know, and yet you put that in there, who would know, and how would it be enforceable? I'm thinking of the helicopter pad in Jackson that was not used for some period of time, and then it was used again. And the town went to court to say it was decommissioned. The court ruled the other way, said it's always been approved for a heliport. No one said it's not a heliport anymore. And so when the new buyer bought it, put it in a helicopter hangar, hit the court's rule, he was able to, the town lost a lot of money defending and fighting that. But when the concept of decommissioning something, I mean, the owner of the property is not going to call the town, oh, by the way, I'm decommissioning my system for a while because I'm changing some of the electronics in it, maybe 6 months, 8 months, whatever. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, the initial decommissioning process was, when we first put it in, when Sarah first drafted, was really something that we were looking at for larger installations. In other words, like a community-based, if you had a 5-acre deal, if that gets decommissioned, somebody's gonna know about that. I agree with you that if there's something on your rooftop and you shut it down, I don't know how the hell you know that. If a commercial entity, say Black Mountain Skier, if we just use them as a for example, if they had a 1,000 panel array to cover their snowmaking and lifts, if they stopped operating as a ski slope and they weren't using that, you might know that. So I guess I think it would be very difficult to monitor it. But I'm not sure that's the right answer to
The ordinance doesn't provide for improving technologies. There's already in Jackson a house whose shingles are solar collectors. There may soon be paint with solar collectors.
Fabrics too.
Hmm?
Fabrics as well.
Yeah, again, the intention really is if it's part of your house, you don't really want to touch
I
it.
mean, so if someone paints their house or has shingles on the roof, do you want to screen that?
No, well, no, it doesn't suggest that.
Well, the house is ground, I mean, the house.
Again, it does not suggest that here. It says only for ground mount. A ground mount requires you to, and it has a very specific definition for a solar installation, and that is in the building code currently, and it has been for years. Ground mount requires that you install a metal pole in the ground, separate from your home. And that's where we're talking about the potential for screening.
Is there, I mean, obviously there's a lot of conversation about decommissioning a system, and there's no way that you could tell, obviously, that's pretty obvious. Could it be worded differently around the aspect of dismantling the system and recycling, as opposed to dismantling and just throwing them in the dump? As opposed to decommissioning is part of the dismantling process, but you could decommission something and leave it in place and not dismantle it. Obviously, it's going to fall into disrepair perhaps over time and be damned ugly, but it's not dismantled. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that was kind of what the intent was if you are going to take it apart,
yes, okay.
that you were going to do it properly and by code. The transfer station probably would not take recycled habits.
Yeah, and the idea around this is we don't really have other technologies that are as blatantly spread across a property, but as a, for example, maybe something like satellite dishes of 30, 40 years ago, where you had a 15-foot satellite dish, and nobody's using those anymore for anything, but you can still see them around occasionally. And the question is whether or not you should have some requirement that if somebody's not using the damn thing, that they take it apart instead of leaving it just sitting around.
I see it a little bit like the law in the books for unregistered vehicles, and you're supposed to have unregistered vehicles that are not currently being used, not on the property, but wink, wink, nod, nod. We've seen certain people not abide by that, and when it hits a critical mass, I think the town reacts. But there's active enforcement, and then there's passive enforcement and community pressure, and I think the latter works better than the former in this case, and I'd see this probably maybe falling into that scenario.
I don't know if this is helpful, but I would imagine with the talk about decommissioning, it's probably like a lot of other things in town. There's all of us maybe have little code violations in our house over time. If it's when you go to sell the house or maybe apply for an STR permit, that's when the town is going to find out that your system's no longer working, and you'll be forced to take it down to sell the house or get an STR permit or something like that.
Yeah, we appreciate any advice you guys have to how we can write this up to make it work.
One way to maybe approach this problem is the town, I believe, voted in that you get tax, not abatements, but you are not taxed if you sold a system. If you have a solar system on your house, I think that was voted in. One or two. Approach it from the perspective that that tax is not a credit or whatever you want to call it, goes away if the system is not functioning.
How many people sitting out there are formerly planning board members? Peter, you're a former, right? No?
It never happened.
School board.
School, yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. I'm just asking.
I was on the ZBA for a little while.
ZBA, and okay. Again, I don't pretend to know everything about solar, and I'm not an engineer, and I'm not particularly good at drafting regulations. So any time you guys are making comments and making, and for those of you who have been part of the process of doing this, you know how hard it is to put these things together in a way that makes sense. And that's all we'd like to do. We'd just like to put them together in a way that makes sense, that most folks, when they come into town, say, look, people are putting solar installations up left and right, but they're doing it well. And that's where I'd like to get to. And that's what the intention of this is. And if we can get there, that's great. And in some ways, we can jury rig it so that it meets everybody's sense of it. I'm not sure if 15 feet's right or 17 feet's right. if it's this angle or that angle. I don't know the answers to that. And the technology to the point around paint and fabrics and other things that might change how we do this. This is gonna have to change. And I hope we're gonna change it as we get different technologies that will enable us to have better regulations. And I also think we shouldn't be fixed on the idea of what we have, other than we try to make our best effort to do it right first. And then as time passes, if we can tweak it, make it better, let's do that.
I think part of what we were trying to avoid was what was happening in Level Maine.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Does if some company came in, as happened at Level, how many people would support that?
Well, that's what I'm kind of curious about, because I think, I can think of a number of different places in town that would support, I guess that's commercial array. And to me, that aspect of, I mean, you look up on Tyrol, there are blinding windows glaring down on town certain times of day. So you have some of that, but it's an interesting thing to think about that, wow, look at this community, they're super proactive in, using renewable energy and that sort of the not in my backyard thing. I can see it both ways. And so I just want to, first of all, commend you all for, just like the short-term rentals, kind of getting ahead, as we've seen in some of these issues. But I don't know if I have a huge, bad feeling about that. I think of Black Mountain, I think, wow, you have solar panels on that. Now you're looking at it from the Tyrol perspective, but grass is beneath. I guess I'm looking at, having traveled out west this summer, and boy, the fracking scenarios, and a lot better having solar panels than a whole huge line of pipes and fracking and all those kind of things going on, so.
I would say it depends. Looking at town property, if you told me a commercial entity wants to come in and do something in the park or at Prospect Farm, I'd say absolutely not. But we have a relatively stagnant dump site around the corner from my house, which is south facing and has a great aspect. It sits there, does nothing. And if somebody wants to do a limited solar there on an acre, a community commercial solar, I'd say, yeah, give me some schematics, let me look at it. I would be totally intrigued by that compared to what's happening there now, which is just basically half stump dump, half a asphalt junk dump. So it depends.
That lot, by the way, is less than 5 acres.
Yeah.
So it would fit.
It would fit in.
Right.
We
So that would
actually
be,
did talk about
so
that.
that's great, yeah,
That
We
was
do it.
size-wise, yeah.
Go ahead, Peter, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I mean, it's just great that you're bringing this out to, everybody, and as we're all trying to kind of work it out and learn together. I mean, it's an interesting time.
Yeah.
It's always tough to sit where you folks are right now, because from my perspective, number one is you did get this down to 2 pages, which is very credible.
Thank you.
And having watched that.
This is
process-
absolutely phenomenal.
From 17 pages.
But the point I want to make is, what you have here is an excellent strongman version out here, which is the purpose of this meeting. And for most of the comments, including the ones I probably made, I think we're tweaking at what you have here as opposed to we're saying, throw this thing out because it's pretty terrible. Some of those restrictions, as we've talked about already, may be a little bit excessive relative to what else, we are restricting in town. And I think those things can be improved, but I think overall, you have the meat of what you need to do to move to the next step.
Thank you.
One thing we just talk about screening, I thought of when people say, well, you really should define it. Well, how would you define it?
Yeah.
Give me some help.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I honestly don't.
How would you define it?
I don't want to see a chain link fence with green wire, you know, like things shielding a solar array. You know, that makes a solar array better. But yeah, I guess I never thought about screening.
Trees,
I want to Google that.
so that you can't see it at all from the road, or that you can only see it if it's 50% screened, or?
Natural vegetation obscures at least approximately 50% of these.
You know, if you drive up north of Berlin, and you drive up through Milan in that area, there's a number of houses, because that's all big lawn. And a number of them have individual ground-mounted systems, which really aren't overpowering relative to the landscape.
Yeah, we just drove through Haverhill, and it was fascinating to see.
Yeah.
That's what people did during COVID.
And solar's a funky thing, because you have to put it relative to where the sun is coming in, or the economics make it impractical. It is not something like a shed, well, I could put it behind my house or to the side of my house. You either put it where the sun is, or you don't do it.
So Ken, you're saying you can't put it where the sun don't shine?
You can, but I would have better ideas, but I don't.
So, I have a question. I mean, it's great. You seem to have a lot of experts in the room and good knowledge, and I mean that in a great way. So Cheryl and I are representing the Wentworth Condo Homeowners Association. We have, forget the residential, the owners, but if you drive out tonight, you look at the number of outdoor electric lights we have all over the complex. Every unit's got some have front and back. We have those 6, 8 lights. We have a hell of an electric bill every month. So we're, no plans, we're just curious. We're here because we're
Not to
curious.
mention the light pollution.
The light pollution and all that. So we love to bring that down. But one thing, so it's, I don't even know if the fixtures or units exist to have photoelectric cells powering those lights and get rid of the electrical feed.
They do.
They do. And so is
The
that
highway department uses them all.
Right, the highway department uses them on the signs and things like that. So is that roof mounted or is that ground mounted?
It's ground mounted.
The beacons kind of ground mounted. So how do they screen?
And to your question, you would be an excellent example of an opportunity for a community scale installation.
I wonder if that would just be considered like an individual like appliance or fixture. I mean, we have cheap little solar lights that light up our pathway when you walk by them. They have like a tiny little solar cell on them. Something for a light, might just be like 6 inches by 6 inches. I wonder if that would even really count as a ground-mounted solar energy system.
Not to mention we get 30-something different bills every month and have to reconcile. That's another story.
Again, the building code defines what those are, and I don't think we need to do that in the regulation in order to, obviously, if you're putting in landscape lighting along your sidewalk, it's a little guy this size, it's solar, yeah, but that does not require a building permit. And even if you're putting a small panel around to,
10,000 of those and you're all set.
what's that?
Just putting 10,000 of those little cheap lights from both and you're all set.
Yes,
I would tend to agree with Ken, is that I guess I get what you're driving, but I don't think you're ready. Ken calls it tweaking, you call it tweaking, later on tweaking. I was chairman of the board for 8 years, and I've been in Jackson for, 40-some years. I haven't seen many ordinances tweaked.
I know.
So I would say that.
we've been really good at tweaking the last 6 years.
I guess what, I guess I get on Ken's train. I think it's.
I'd like to go ahead.
But I don't think you're right.
Well, I guess the question would be, is that, do we want to get in front of it? I mean, we could let this ride for 2 years, 6 years, 12 years, and not do anything because we can't agree. As opposed to trying to get something, and the reason we have a listening session is to listen, to see what things we can change. And if that's the intention, that we would follow up.
Did you check with the North Country Council at all on the wording of this?
We have looked at, and I kid you not, at least 8 different model ordinances that have been prepared. Yeah, they're not sure if North Country Council is a particular
We
unit.
belong to our country council, and that's a great resource.
Right, and they would probably tell us to use the model that's been developed by the New Hampshire
Municipal
organization. That was actually what we started with, and then added or subtracted, and added and subtracted.
I mean, we've done our homework. I mean, from 17 pages of regulations, we've tried to strip it down to 2. And part of the problem stripping it down to 2 is that you lose a lot of the, specific language that some of these things are 2 pages to define 1 word. Seriously. And it's like, do we really want to get into that? Versus we want to have a guideline that pretty much says, here's the intention. And there are building codes already out there, and what we're trying to do is give Kevin a little bit more leeway in terms of how he looks at the thing before he does the approval. And he has a little bit more regulation, if you will, to say, look, that really is not a really good idea. Fits the building code, but we have a zoning ordinance that says you can't put it 28 feet from the center of the road because that's the setback that's allowed. With no trees. And by the way, you can put a 500-foot installation that's 15 feet high that has 700 panels. And you can do that along Carbon Notch, or you can do it along Black Mountain Road, or you can do it on anything 16. You can do it on wonderful slanted slope places if you have the property.
Do it in Jackson Village. I mean, you have a lot of open space in Jackson Village.
Next to the library.
Well, the problem with Jackson Village is that a lot of the area of Jackson Village is in the floodplain. And you cannot do an installation in the floodplain. That's prohibited by the building. So,
Bill, if I understand your process, this is an informal hearing.
Yep.
And you meet as a committee again.
Yep.
You take this input, and then you have a public hearing, correct?
That's in December.
So that's when you can decide, after you've made whatever changes you decide to make, whether you're going to pull the plug or not.
Yeah, I mean,
Before you-
like you said, this is our strong, this
Right.
is our, we kind of want to do this. We'll take all the input that we get this evening and see if we can do something better.
No, that's great, I just wanted the clarification of those next steps, because the intention ultimately is, once you do the public hearing, is to hopefully bring something forward at town meeting in March. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious.
And we get 2 public hearings to do this.
Yep.
Then it goes before the voters for a vote. I mean, you guys get to decide whether or not you like the thing, or you can choose not to do anything. You choose to vote it down and say, you don't like this stuff. The idea is really to get something out there that most of us would look at and say, yeah, that looks pretty good. I don't think we get it perfect, though.
And if we don't do anything, we could end up with another situation like short-term rentals.
Like, I'm sorry.
Like short-term rentals. Where it gets ahead of us.
Some people might argue we didn't do a good job on that, so. Arthur?
I think hearing everything you said and discussed, and it makes much more sense and clarification. The only thing I think that bothers me, just rattles me a little bit, other than steep slopes, is the idea of calling it commercial. The idea of commercial and going back and saying, oh no, this is only an accessory, and playing with those 2 terms. Commercial, it just, you've got a commercial building, you've got a commercial business who's using solar. that to me just doesn't pop out as it should, because when I'm hearing this, keep saying, oh, we're going to have business solar here. And I know we're not. And you have to sort of read through to understand that. It just, I think, has to be more on your
I
face.
think the term that's used is utility scale, which is like what level was. I mean,
Oh,
I have to double
utility
check.
scale.
Utility scale,
Oh.
industrial scale,
But it's not clear. I mean, it's like
Whereas,
we're not using-
whereas if somebody like Christmas Farm Inn or Snowflake Inn wanted to, they are a commercial operation, they would put it in. But
Yes.
it's not a commercial unit, and that's the differentiation.
It's not a commercial
It is,
use.
but for flat out understanding,
Yeah.
it's not blatantly clear. Somehow in the wording, that we're talking commercial
I don't
buildings,
think the
not
word
commercial
commercial
solar.
is in this at all.
No.
It's in there, but you have to read it
I had trouble with that as well. And that this idea, and maybe we don't do a good job of identifying what we mean by accessory use.
I think it's another word. Rather than using commercial, you're saying business, even the word business solar.
I don't think either of those words are in there.
We don't say commercial at all here, we don't say business at all.
I thought.
I can double check, but usually I think utility scale means you're producing it to sell into the grid.
That's where we use accessory use is that, and maybe we need to do a better job of defining what those are.
Accessories already in them.
But you have to be careful of the language, because in the summer I sell to the grid, in the winter I buy from the grid.
Well, for example, the town property, the town garage, that has solar panels. Is that a commercial use because the person, the company that put that on there is deriving a financial benefit from the power that's produced there? Is that a commercial use?
But the entity that it's on is not commercial.
Can accessory use mean both residential and commercial?
Yeah.
Like if an inn puts up
Yeah.
panels,
That's
just the
what-
power they're in, that means it's accessory use.
That's
Yeah,
accessory.
that first comment, the early comment around how do we define accessory, if we said it's 150% of the current load, something like that, then that would, you can't go commercial if having an installation that's gonna just simply be 50% more than your current load in your home.
But aren't most solar systems don't they go into the grid?
Absolutely, yes.
And you derive a benefit financially from that.
Help me understand this, somebody who's got a solar array currently.
Net metering.
Knows this better than I do.
Net metering works that, because we're on the co-op and all of Jackson is on the co-op. When I produce a kilowatt of energy, and I produce a kilowatt that's in excess of what I'm using at that instant, it goes onto the grid and I get paid a rate. At night, when I'm not producing but I'm taking it, I now have to buy it from the grid, and I have to actually pay more than what I get paid from when I put it into the grid. And there's logic behind it. It doesn't sound fair, but there is logic behind that, because I am using the grid as my battery.
I think that rate is set by.
That is correct. Yeah. Well, actually, it varies depending on, some of it is and some of it isn't. But that's basically how net metering works. And so what you're really looking at is the annual usage as opposed to the instantaneous usage. Because in the summer, we produce far more than we use in the house. And in the winter, obviously, your production is minimal, to say the least. And then the credit that we built out goes against our electric bill in the winter. And that's classic.
That's fairly typical.
That's net metering today. Those rules are getting changed and bounced around a little bit. But I do think that you want to move forward, because the Inflation Reduction Act has changed the way that heat pumps, electric cars, solar are going to be really enhanced because of the Inflation Reduction Act. And as people get more educated, I think you are going to see more people move in that particular direction. You're also going to see municipalities such as Jackson they should take a serious look at it, because when the town put in solar you couldn't take the tax credits because there was no, because Jackson doesn't generate any taxes. The new Inflation Reduction Act gets rid of that middleman, which is what the town is paying right now. I think the towns would revision, but that was the only model that made sense at the time that the town put it in. Now with the Inflation Reduction Act, the town can directly take the 30% discount on the cost of putting it in, as can domestic and so on and so forth. And that's a huge difference between nonprofits and municipalities, really were a huge disadvantage before. With the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not currently penalized the way they were before because they couldn't take the tax credits. So the pressure, the financial incentive for towns like Jackson to move ahead are much different now than they were when you put the system in before.
But I guess what I was referring to, in as much as there's an exchange of money, value, is that commercial? And it's, or accessory. I mean, that to me is sort of.
If you bought a piece of land and all you did was to put the solar panels on it, maxed out how many solar panels you put on a piece of land, and then sold that energy to the electric company, then you became a proprietor. That would be a commercial.
But if you lived on that property.
If you lived on that property and the solar that you put in met your needs, then that would be accessory.
There's actually a modification to that, though, is you could buy, Snowflake Inn could buy a parcel of land that's not where the Snowflake Inn is, put a system in, and still function within the co-op, as long as that power was credited back to Snowflake Inn's utility.
No, it's a revenue source that's not associated with their.
In that case, it's not actually a revenue source in the classic sense, it's a reduction of the expense of operating your facility.
I don't know, is there some requirement that we put in then to modify in our residential district that we actually put another line that says such and such use of installation is prohibited?
I'm not sure.
As an installation that is
Yeah,
put in place solely
intended
for,
as a commercial.
right, not to be used for your residents, that you happen to coexist on the same piece of land, that you have this massive solar array that
Yeah.
you're selling everything else, but a small portion.
Yeah.
I think we've already covered that when we were talking about, say, defining accessory use as being 150% of present load.
And as Bill pointed out earlier correctly, that becomes a commercial use in the residential area, which is not legal under your current zone.
If you had your one lot you just sold.
If you came in with a utility scale proposal and you're trying to put it in the residential area, you can't do it under your current zone.
But how about under Route 16 is commercial?
Yeah, you guys are commercial.
Yeah,
So fit it in within
So we're
500
gonna
feet.
put the pig farm up there, maybe it's
Especially in the
so-
slanted, yeah.
So we're not covered under this? The commercial isn't covered under it? This is just rural residential?
No. If you read the zoning ordinance,
I'm not clear on
Yeah,
like residential.
because we didn't do it just for residential, we said it has to be accessory to the lot. It has to be accessory to the lot, so that would cover commercial as well as residential.
But it says
We tried to
here,
avoid
rural
that.
residential district regulations, as
If
opposed to.
go to your zoning ordinance, page 7, it's talking about uses in the village district, which you know is the area in town plus along Route 16, the way it's been defined for a few years now. Uses permitted, number 1, all uses permitted in the rural residential district, and in addition. So there's more things that are allowed, businesses, restaurants, hotels, motels, cetera, that are permitted within village, which are not permitted in the rural residential.
I see what you're
Rural
saying.
residential. Use is permitted, there's a list of 9 of them. Residences, farms, forestry, open space, nature trails, customary home occupations.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying, though. We should run up the flagpole and say, the way we've got it written up, does that prevent someone from, in the 16 corridor, from doing something different than what we allow in any residential, just to make sure? I hear you.
This has happened before.
Yes, I hear you. We also want to run this through council. I've requested that we can review this with council. We have to ask permission from the select board, which we've done. And they haven't yet had the opportunity to get back to us to say, okay, but we would want to cover this with council. And I think we'll go through each of the provisions and ask, is the way it's worded, written up in a way that meets our expectation. So I'm listening, taking that into consideration, and we'll do that, and hopefully by the time we get to the formal public hearing, we'll have that fixed. That's why we're here today. Really, we're here to listen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
This will be on the agenda for December planning.
Just in case, yeah.
Just in
something
case
to
you want
do
to
on
come.
Thursday night. Thursday.
Planning board meeting.
We have a great opportunity to see, we expected a real crowd. We want people to be